Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, my name is Grace Murray, and I want to welcome you to the Freer and Sackler Galleries. Thank you for joining us today. We are thrilled to have here today a visiting scholar who is going to be introduced to you in just a moment to kick off our talk and conversation. Our conversation today is called Beyond Images of Beauty, Women's Lives in Edo-Period Japan. And I want to just give you a few reminders before we get started. Please be sure that your cell phones and mobile devices are on silent as we begin the talk. And also, you're invited to join us immediately afterwards for a performance by Katsura Sunshine of Rakugo, which is a traditional form of Japanese comic storytelling, also related to this exhibition, Inventing Utamaro, a Japanese masterpiece rediscovered. So stay for the talk and conversation, and then join us again at 3:30 for the Rakugo performance. I am going to give the mic now to Dr. Julie Nelson Davis, who's one of the co-curators of this exhibition, and she's going to introduce our speaker today. Julie?
Thank you so much, Grace, and thank you everyone for coming today. It's an absolutely gorgeous day, and I thank you for coming inside. We're going to have a wonderful conversation with Amy, and then we'll have more sunshine with Katsura Sunshine. I couldn't resist a terrible pun, I'm sorry. Okay, today, as Grace mentioned, I'm Julie Nelson Davis. I'm the guest curator for this exhibition. I'm also a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. I'll be joined in conversation with Dr. Stanley and also with Dr. Ulak, who is the senior curator of Japanese art here at the Freer and Sackler. Okay, so I want to also let you know that this program is being live streamed on YouTube, so think wisely about your choices during this period of time. And also, if you feel moved to tweet about this program, please use the hashtag Utamaro. Thank you so much. So it's truly an honor to introduce our speaker, Dr. Amy Stanley, today. I met Dr. Stanley a number of years ago when she came to the University of Pennsylvania, and she gave an absolutely stellar talk on the history of prostitution in Japan. And I'm delighted to welcome her here today. Dr. Stanley is an associate professor of history at Northwestern University, where she teaches the history of early modern and modern Japan. She holds a BA and a PhD from Harvard. In her first book, Selling Women, Prostitution, Households, and the Market in Early Modern Japan, here is the object. It is, in my opinion, a remarkable achievement. This book explores how an expanding market for sex transformed the Japanese economy and changed women's lives between 1600 and 1868. It has profoundly changed the way we think about that history. Not only does Dr. Stanley draw out the big picture as it was formed by the big actors, informing us of the ways in which the shogunate and its bureaucracy organized life in early modern Japan, she also makes us understand and really care about the lives of ordinary people, and she recounts a number of very moving stories of women in the Edo period that are really better than fiction. I mean, it's an amazing achievement. So I could think of no better introduction to the topic of sex work in the period than Dr. Stanley, and thus when we came to make this program, she was our first and only choice for today. Dr. Stanley is also one of those scholars whose work keeps moving us forward. She has written about adultery in the Edo period, about education for geisha in the first years of the Meiji era, and the figure of the migrant maidservant in global history. Her new project, Stranger in the Shogun City, is a history of the city of Edo in the early 19th century, told through the life story of a runaway divorcee who married a masterless samurai and entered the service of a famous city magistrate. This new book is already under contract and will be coming out in 2020 from Scribner. And Amy, I think you should definitely keep the film rights for that book because it sounds awesome. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Amy Stanley.
First, I wanted to thank Julie for the wonderful introduction and to Grace Murray for arranging my visit. It's a privilege to be here today to see this wonderful exhibit and to be in the presence of such gorgeous paintings. And since the paintings are why we're here, I'm going to start with them. So we have cherry blossoms at Yoshiwara, moonlight at Shinagawa, and snow at Fukagawa. So to look at these images that Utamaro created is to be overwhelmed by beauty. There are snowy gardens and cherry blossoms. There are gleaming golds to tummy mats and coffered ceilings and balconies. There are sliding doors that open out to a moonlit ocean. And in these spectacular settings, there are dozens of beautiful women with white faces wearing patterned silk kimono that trail behind them on the floor. They play instruments. They carry trays. They whisper behind fans. They drink sake and play games and smoke and gaze out at the ocean or the garden or the street. And looking at a scene like this one, you feel like you've been invited to an impossibly elegant party. It's a fantasy of leisure and pleasure and recreation. But if you look at it a different way, this is also an illustration of work, because the women that Utamaro depicted in these paintings were not party guests. They were professional entertainers. They were high-class prostitutes and geisha. And while they often did wear beautiful clothes and they entertained clients in scenic places, they were not there to pursue pleasure themselves, but to make money. And usually they were not making money for themselves, but for their parents, or for a brothel keeper, or for a geisha housemaster. So from one perspective, yes, Utamaro depicted a series of elegant parties. But from another perspective, he gave us three views of an enormous profit-making operation that engaged the labor of hundreds of thousands of poor young women in early modern Japan. So that's the world I'm going to take you into in my talk today. Not the glamorous floating world of pleasure that Utamaro created with his brush, but into a harsher and more difficult reality. So I'll discuss the economic and social conditions in which prostitution was practiced in Edo, and what we know about the lives of women who might have appeared in scenes like this one. So first, some general background. Utamaro created these paintings in the city of Edo around the year 1800, so in the middle of what we call Japan's Tokugawa period, or early modern period, that goes from 1600 to 1868. Edo was the shogun's capital. It is also the city we now know as Tokyo. And in 1800, it was probably the biggest city in the world, with a population of somewhere around 1.2 million. Now, to put that into perspective for you, at the time, London had about 1 million people, Paris had about 550,000, and New York was a tiny outpost of 60,000 people. Washington, D.C. at the time was not really even a city yet. It had 8,000 people, and by Japanese standards, that was like a town, medium-sized town. In 1800, though, Edo was relatively new, especially for a city this size. So this is a map of Edo around 1800. And in 1800, and actually still today, Tokyo is about the same age as New York City. But while I told you that New York City had a population of about 60,000, Edo grew much faster and had a population of 1.2 million. In 1600, around when the city was established, it had been a cluster of fishing villages that surrounded a rudimentary medieval castle. This medieval castle was deserted, it was dilapidated, it had a thatched roof, it had an entrance that was made out of the used wooden planks from ships. So this was not an important place. Around 1590, when the man who would be the first Tokugawa shogun, Tokugawa Ieyasu, chose this site as his headquarters. And so he swept away the fishing villages and he renovated the castle. And he called in thousands of samurai, that is warriors, to live within the newly reconstructed castle's moats. So Edo was initially a military settlement, and it retained that character even as the city grew. It was always dominated by Edo Castle. If you look at this map, that pink blotch in the middle there is the land that was dedicated to Edo Castle. If you look at a map of the Tokyo subway system today, you'll see something similar. You'll see a green patch in the middle, which is the Imperial Palace, that sits on the original site of Edo Castle. So Edo, as I said, was the seat of the shogun. Edo Castle is where the shogun lived. And samurai, most of them men, accounted for around 60% of the population. If you look at that black blotch representing the castle Edo, in the middle of that map, you'll see there's a moat around it. There's actually both an inner moat and an outer moat. All around the castle were mostly samurai residences, and these samurai were there to provide a layer of defense for the castle. So those people, those samurai, both the ones who always lived there and the ones who came in and out, accounted for about 60% of the city's population, and commoners made up the other 40%, but even among that group, men outnumbered women until the middle of the 19th century. So this was an enormous city in 1800, and it was also a male-dominated one, although it was starting to be home to more and more commoner women too. And at the same time, Edo was also a city of neighborhoods. So there were the samurai neighborhoods surrounding the castle, quiet places, bancho, koishikawa, surugadai, that had walled-in compounds and guard posts. And then there were commoner neighborhoods, which were generally more boisterous and varied. Nihonbashi, which was a place for commerce and transport, still the headquarters of some major Japanese banks, home to big merchant houses in this period. There was the theater district, which was this crowded, glamorous place where you could go see kabuki and puppet theater and buy makeup and wooden dolls. There was Kanda, which had a big vegetable market and a lot of ordinary shopkeepers. And Asakusa, dominated by Sensoji Temple, which I'll talk about in a minute, which was a pilgrimage site and entertainment center. And I mention this about Edo and its neighborhoods because when Utamaro painted the three works in his series, he was referencing the geography of Edo. So Yoshiwara, Shinagawa, and Fukagawa, all in different parts of the city. So if you plot these paintings on the map of Edo, this is what it looks like. Now, all of these places were known for their brothels, so they're places that people could go to pursue sexual entertainment. Now, when you look at the paintings themselves, these places look like they might be interchangeable at first glance, except for that beautiful ocean at Shinagawa. You generally see interiors, right? You see the inside of a restaurant or a brothel with these beautiful, beautifully dressed women. But these places actually are quite different. They occupy different positions within the political economy of prostitution in the city, as well as different places on the map. So we should start, I think, with Yoshiwara because it's the oldest and also the prototypical quote-unquote pleasure quarter, yukaku. In 1612, so just after the city was founded, when Edo's population was still mostly male samurai, when civil war was not a distant memory, but a very recent one, a brothel keeper named Jinemon submitted a petition to the shogunate asking the government to recognize his business and grant him a plot of land where he and his colleagues could ply their trade. He promised that in return, he would provide surveillance of what was a very dangerous business. So he would record the comings and goings of customers, and he would report on suspicious activities. Now you can imagine how important this was to the shogunate, which was not yet secure in its power. It had gathered all these armed men who are now roaming around this new city. They were very concerned about suspicious activity on the part of samurai who might try to overthrow the new shogunate. And brothels are excellent hiding places. So this made a lot of sense. Jinemon was very savvy in his petition. He also promised that with the cooperation of the shogunate, he'd make sure that prostitution didn't take place outside his designated district. So he and his brothel keepers would have a monopoly on the business of selling sex in Edo, and the shogunate would have order. The deal was made, a new quarter was constructed, and the original Yoshiwara opened for business in 1618. Now, the original district was not in the place that I've labeled on this map. It was originally much closer to Edo Castle in the city center. But in 1656, the shogunate had forced those brothels to relocate to what it called the new Yoshiwara, which is where it is on this map. This is where it was in Utamaro's day. This is what he painted in his kind of fabulous scene. And you'll see on this more zoomed-in map that the relocated Yoshiwara is right there in that kind of box, and it is right next to the big temple Sensoji, which was the center of a commoner entertainment district. And you'll notice that even in the 1850s, when this map was made, that little box of Yoshiwara, which is a little bit outside that circle now, kind of got moved. Let me see if I can go back to the original one. It's surrounded by green. And that green is rice fields. So even in 1850, this part of Edo was remote. This is on the edge of the built-up city. The other notable thing about this district was that it was surrounded by walls, which you can kind of get a sense of on this map, but which you can see better, I think, in this map from around 1846. This level of fortification was intended to make surveillance easier, so you can keep track of the people who are coming in and going out. And also, it was a way of keeping women in, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. At the time this map was drawn up, there were about 7,000 women working as prostitutes in Yoshiwara, which, as you can see, was a very small space. And that number doesn't count brothel keepers or shopkeepers or other entertainers. So there were probably about 10,000 people in this neighborhood, which were kept within walls. And you can imagine that this was very claustrophobic, especially since there was only one main way in and out, which was the Great Gate, which you can see all the way at the right of this image, and which you can see another view of in this woodblock print. Here you can also see cherry blossoms, which are one of the famous sites of Yoshiwara. Now, because Yoshiwara was as a space apart from the rest of the city, many men envisioned it the way that Utamaro seemed to in his painting, as a separate world enclosed in walls, which offered freedom and fulfillment, a respite from ordinary life. But the women who worked in that district saw it differently, as a place of danger and confinement and imprisonment. And actually, the shogunate literally used Yoshiwara as a place of imprisonment for women. So throughout the 17th into the 18th centuries, there were cases when the shogunate condemned women to compulsory service in Yoshiwara as punishment usually for women who committed sexual indiscretions, things that fell just short of the legal definition of adultery, which was a capital crime. Confinement in Yoshiwara could also be a punishment for illegal prostitution, that is, for selling sex outside the designated quarter. Most of the women who were apprehended for that crime were independent operators, streetwalkers, or women who were under the control of pimps who were their own fathers sometimes or husbands. The brothel keepers in Yoshiwara actually had a right to go out into the city and apprehend these women, and if they were found guilty of selling sex outside the quarter, they could then be sent to compulsory service in Yoshiwara for free. And these women usually became the cheapest, least glamorous prostitutes in the quarter. But in a sense, all the women who worked as prostitutes in Yoshiwara, no matter how glamorous, were imprisoned. They were confined by the gates and walls of their district, and they were also bound by a legal mechanism, and that is the indenture contract that obligated them to work for brothel keepers. These contracts were standardized, and they all said the same thing. So this is boilerplate in the early modern period. The woman's guardian, usually her father, received a sum of money up front, usually some quantity of ryo, let's say 10 ryo. And in return, the woman was obligated to work for a set period of time, usually several years, to pay off that debt. The brothels would provide food, clothing, and lodging. The woman was not allowed to leave the brothel before her contract expired. If she escaped, her parents were obligated to search for her and bring her back. If they couldn't bring her back, they forfeited that original contract money plus interest. Now, when a woman signed her contract, usually by dipping her fingernail in ink and pressing it to the page, she also acknowledged that she could be sold to any other brothel at any time without her consent. There are not many contracts that survive from Yoshiwara itself. Yoshiwara burned a lot, which I'll get to in a minute. But here is the signature page of a transfer contract that transferred a woman from one brothel to another in Edo, in Nezu. And you can see here there are the seals of all the people involved in this transaction. There is her master, Hitonushi, which is the original brothel keeper. There is an ukenin, a guarantor. There are many people who are kind of intermediaries. And then at the very end, there's the woman herself. It's written toku. And there is her the mark of her fingernail, because of course she did not have a seal to sign the document herself. Prostitutes had usually been sold into indentured servitude by their parents. Often they were very young at the time of sale. And in contract after contract, you see explanations from poor townspeople and peasants saying things like, we couldn't afford medicine, or we couldn't afford to pay our taxes, and so we had no choice but to indenture our daughter to a brothel. Now, this situation seems absolutely tragic to us, and it did to people in the Tokugawa period as well. An Edo samurai wrote in 1816, "It is not easy to sell a child, and it is a fearful thing to send her to hell for life. In distant provinces and remote regions, where people grow up with constant shortages and live together in hardship, what must it be like to sell a beloved child raised at your bosom to a faraway place you have never seen, and for parents and child never to see one another again?" But this sympathy did not necessarily translate into a condemnation of prostitution itself. In fact, both brothel keepers and government officials defended the sex trade on the grounds that it allowed daughters to sacrifice themselves to save their poor families, and thus provided a way for the desperately impoverished to survive. But many of the women who worked in prostitution didn't survive themselves, and the time they spent in service was, as the Edo samurai put it, hell on earth. In Edo popular culture, there was a lot of talk about how the most sought after and expensive prostitutes could refuse clients. They would say, even if these men are very rich, if they're vulgar, a very, very refined and elegant prostitute will reject him. And there is this image that survives to this day that Edo prostitutes are actually more like courtesans, that they had this degree of autonomy. But in reality, if a brothel keeper wanted to compel a woman to see a client, he could, because he literally owned the rights to her body. That's what this contract meant. And if she refused, she would be punished. So Yoshiwara was a miserable place to work, even for the highest ranking women who were celebrated for their beauty and artistic accomplishment. They were subject to the economic calculations of the business, and they were not free to leave. They were also not permitted to form romantic attachments to men who were not paying guests. And so the tragic story of the Yoshiwara prostitute in love with a man who couldn't pay to see her was a common topic for Edo period plays and stories. For an indentured prostitute, there were only 3 ways out of the Great Gate of Yoshiwara. One was to die, which was probably the most common. Rates of venereal disease, particularly syphilis, were staggering. There are also your standard early modern city epidemics. There were fires. The quarter burned a lot. It was very crowded. People had lanterns and braziers. It was made of wood. Also, sometimes women committed arson in order to provide kind of camouflage so they could escape. And there was also suicide, another kind of fairly frequent cause of death. The second way to be bought out of Yoshiwara was to be bought out, and this usually happened when a man wanted to take a prostitute as his wife or concubine, and he wasn't willing to wait till the end of her term. So if he had enough money, he could pay that original indenture money plus interest, and the brothel would sometimes let her go. This was the best case scenario for many women. And the third way was to survive to the end of a contract term. At that point, the brothel would ordinarily let the woman go, and then she'd be turned out to make her own way in the city, and women could survive in Edo by doing many different things. Women who worked in the next of Utamaro's districts, Shinagawa, which I spelled wrong somehow, Shinagawa with an A. Shinagawa, which you can see on this map, spelled right, hopefully, were in much the same situation. Their district wasn't enclosed by walls, but they too were held to indenture contracts that were pretty much the same. The main difference was that they were called serving girls or waitresses, meshimori onna. So all those beautiful women that you see in that picture were technically called waitresses. And they were called this because it was a specific legal term for women who worked as prostitutes on the shogun's highways. And as you can see on this map, Shinagawa is really on the southern boundary of Edo. North is not up on this map. It's to the right, very confusing. And Shinagawa was not technically in Edo. Instead, it was a post station, the first one along the Tokaido Highway, which led from Edo to Kyoto. So here you see an illustration of the Tokaido Highway. The first stop, if you're going from Edo, is Edo Nihonbashi in the middle of the city, and the second stop is Shinagawa. So a post station was a place that had inns for travelers, but more importantly to the shogunate, it was a place that provided pack horses and lodging to official samurai traveling on official business. So you can see this side of Shinagawa in this print, which shows what it looked like as a post station. You can see the travelers and the horses with their packs and their loads. You can also see the view onto the ocean, which is the same thing that you see in the Utamaro print, just from a different painting, just from a different perspective. Shinagawa was, though, in a tough position for a post station because it was the first one on the way out of Edo. And that meant that it had a lot of official business. But it also meant that if you were just an ordinary traveler coming from Edo, you could just walk right through it in a day. You did not have to stay overnight. And that meant that Shinagawa didn't have a lot of ordinary travelers who would subsidize all this official business that the post station had to pay for. And therefore, as a result, Shinagawa was allowed to have 500 prostitutes officially in order to attract customers who would compensate for that lack of business. And also the shogunate taxed that business, so they were reaping revenue from the business of prostitution at Shinagawa, which went to the magistrate of roads so that they could keep the highway system going. Shinagawa is probably the most famous and the busiest of the post-station brothel districts, but there were these serving girls at waitresses at almost every stop on almost all of the shogun's highways. There were conservatively tens of thousands of women who worked as serving girls all over Japan, and because there were so many, we have a lot of documentation about them. The only known case in the Tokugawa period in which a prostitute wrote herself about her own experience comes from a post station. It's this woman named Hatsu, who in 1838 wrote a petition to the road magistrate asking to be released from her contract. She explained that she was writing herself because, quote, "My father back in the province is so poor he had to sell me. He can't come and appeal for mercy here, and he has many other things to do, so he is unable to help me." She went on to explain that she'd been born in Echigo province, which is where the city of Niigata is now, and her parents, who were sick and deeply in debt, had indentured her to this post station, which is in what is now Gunma Prefecture. And after working for only a few months, she got sick. And in her petition, she wrote, "At night I was sent out to see customers, and in the afternoon, when there were no customers, I was sent to the mountains to gather firewood. Since I had no chance to rest during the day or night, I could not recover from my illness. I would be viciously beaten if I begged my master to be allowed to rest even a little." We don't know what happened to Hatsu, who really wrote her petition in her own hand, very kind of laboriously copied it out. It's likely, though, that her petition was unsuccessful. We do know that many serving girls did die during their terms of service for the same reasons that Yoshiwara prostitutes did, and their graveyards are often still evident in former post-station towns. But interestingly, those who survived and were released often married. And a good example of how these former prostitutes fared in the marriage market comes also from the Gunma Prefecture, from the post station of Kuragano. In 1803, for complicated reasons, the shogunate raided the station and liberated a bunch of former serving girls. And they temporarily detained 51 women who had lost their jobs. And of those, 45 of the 51 married local peasants. Others were adopted, became nuns, found other work. In other cases, we still have contracts from local men, like peasants, who bought out serving girls in post stations in order to marry them. And this was easier than it was in Yoshiwara because post station contracts were usually cheaper, and because it was easier for peasant men to have frequent contact in these post stations that weren't walled in. So in most of Japan, the line between prostitutes and other women was not as stark as the gates and walls of Yoshiwara might suggest. And this was particularly true in the last of Utamaro's locations, Fukagawa. Fukagawa was a relatively new part of Edo, and it was still semi-suburban in Utamaro's time. It did have a reputation for elegance, so a number of, for example, very famous kabuki actors had their villas in Fukagawa. The women in this painting, Snow at Fukagawa, are not only prostitutes, but also geisha. Now, I have to back up for a minute and to say today, geisha are absolutely not sex workers. They are artistically accomplished women who are paid to perform and to entertain. In Utamaro's day, though, those boundaries, too, were kind of blurry. The first geisha who worked in Edo were actually men, and they worked in the pleasure quarter of Yoshiwara, and they entertained at parties. Often they played music, they played drums. Eventually, they were joined by women who thought this was a pretty good idea, also called themselves geisha, but they were forbidden to sell sex because it interfered with the Yoshiwara brothel keeper's business. They're concerned about their monopoly. By the 18th century, there are also geisha in other parts of the city, including Fukagawa. And the Fukagawa geisha were the most famous. They too took their lead from the original male geisha, and they even went out wearing men's coats, haori. They became very famous for their kind of gender-bending style. And they also played music and they danced at parties. Most of these women actually were under contracts that said the exact same thing as a prostitute's contract. But some of them were freelancers or town geisha whose parents had trained them and sent them out to work. And the city magistrate's office was very concerned about this. It said, these are machi geisha, town geisha, whose parents trained them in music and dance, pay for all these lessons, and send them out to work. Ordinarily, they don't partake in prostitution, but sometimes they do if they have trouble making ends meet, or sometimes they become short-term concubines, which is basically the same thing. And the shogunate went on and on about how terrible this was because it was basically parents allowing their daughters to engage in illicit sex, not really paying attention to the fact that that was, in fact, what the whole prostitution industry was already. Incidentally, you would think that the people who would be most upset about this would be those original Yoshiwara brothel keepers, because they were supposed to have a monopoly on the sale of sex in Edo. But it turns out that this situation, too, was a little more complicated. Yoshiwara brothel keepers had extensive ties to their counterparts in other areas, including Fukagawa and Shinagawa. Part of it was that they relied on the same networks of procurers, these shady men who would go into the countryside or poor neighborhoods and get women to be indentured to brothels. There was also a matter of geography. Yoshiwara burned down a lot for all the reasons I mentioned, including their arson problem. And whenever Yoshiwara burned, the brothels had to relocate. And sometimes they went to the temple Sensoji, but other times they relocated to Fukagawa. And they relocated to Fukagawa because it was relatively nearby and because it was an already established prostitution district. So Yoshiwara brothel keepers actually had a pretty good relationship with brothel keepers and geisha house proprietors in Fukagawa. So in that sense, the business of prostitution in Edo was really one business. Customers had choices. They could go to any of these places, but they were seeing women who were caught in the same system, who made money for brothel keepers and or for their parents, and who, with the exception of some of the Fukagawa geisha, were trapped in contracts that did not allow them to profit from their own work at all. Now, most people in the Tokugawa period didn't think this was a problem. In fact, if they thought about where the money was going, they were relieved that women were not able to profit from their work in prostitution themselves. If they could do this, people thought, they might abandon their husbands and the whole idea of the family. It was seen as better, more moral, that women worked on behalf of their parents, that they rescued their families by sacrificing themselves. But that's not what we see in these paintings. Instead, we seem to see the opposite, a fantasy of beauty and pleasure, a geography of the city of Edo that tells you what you might be able to see if you arrived at the most elegant brothel at a perfect time of year, and you could purchase the company of the most elegant, celebrated, exquisite, expensive women. These paintings don't show you the violence of life in the pleasure quarter or the disease or the fires. They keep you in one moment, at the party. They don't show you the past, the poor girl in a city neighborhood being led away by a procurer, and they don't show you the future, an early death, a release from service, or a convenient marriage. And they don't show you what's outside the frame, the low-ranking brothels, the emaciated streetwalkers, or the graveyards. And perhaps most importantly, they never show you the money changing hands. This doesn't take anything away from the beauty of Utamaro's work. And it also doesn't take away from the complexity and diversity of women's experiences in prostitution in the Tokugawa period. One interesting thing about the moral argument about prostitution in Utamaro's time is that people almost never blamed prostitutes for their work. Everyone knew they hadn't chosen it, and they were seen mostly as victims or as tragic heroines. They were not stigmatized for having sex outside of marriage. And as a result, these women who had been in terms of service in brothels could move on if they survived their contract term. They often married or became townswomen, peasant wives. And for girls who had grown up in desperately poor peasant families, this might have been a kind of social mobility. In fact, board games for women, which were kind of like our life in which you can kind of move through squares representing things that you could be in life, often had squares for high-ranking prostitutes next to squares for high-ranking concubines and even wives. Here's an example that's not a board game. This is a map of a woman's path through life. It's 1756. And it shows you the kind of possibilities that might await you if you were born. So you start out at Conception Mountain, and you pass through the road of girlhood. And from there, you have a branch in your pathway. And if you end up in prostitution, you get sent down the path of prostitution, you end up having to take a shamisen boat. Shamisen's an instrument. It represents musical training, to Pleasure Quarter Province, which is an island. From there, you can take a redemption boat and end up on Nun Island and become a nun. Or you can climb an arduous path to that blue dot, which is Concubine Hall, which is actually a pretty good space on the map to end up. So the answer to the question of what lies behind these gorgeous paintings isn't a simple or an easy one. There are many stories about prostitution in Edo. There are stories about the development of the city and its economy. There are stories about transactions between brothel keepers and parents. There are stories about magistrates who wanted order but needed tax revenue. And of course, there are stories about women who worked in prostitution, the ones who suffered and died, the ones who found their way out, and the ones who might have made their way to slightly easier lives. They appear to us today as images of beauty. They are to be admired and appreciated in museums like this one. But I think we owe it to them to understand the complexity of the society they came from and the reality of the lives they might have lived.
Wow, thank you so much, Amy. That was fantastic. So now I invite Jim to join Amy and me up here at the table, and we'll have a conversation about this great material. And then we'll open it up to questions. Okay, thanks again, Amy. That was great. I have a question about this map. It's so fabulous. One place you might end up is Concubine Hall. Were there other places, like, being a wife or being a mother?
Yeah, so being a wife and being a mother is usually the top center position on the map, and the best place that you can end up. So there is a whole kind of way that these board games or these maps were designed, and the object was to get to the top. And so Concubine Hall is toward the top, but it's not the best place you can end up, and that would be to be retired sometimes, to be a retired wife and mother and a wealthy person.
Thanks a lot, Amy. This was most informative. I have a lot of questions, but they may seem rather particular. The map reminded me in general of this penchant in the Edo period to overlay the world of the brothel with religious or Buddhist import. Tales of a man going from one point to another on a skiff, as if he were being taken through the routes of salvation. Tachikawa Ryu, which develops a little bit later in the Edo period, where prostitutes are actually seen as manifestations of bodhisattvas and so forth. What was the instinct going on there? Was this was there a reality to this? Was there a connection to true religiosity, or was it just a game?
I don't know. I'm not sure. I will say that I think it was in the Yoshiwara brothel keepers' interests to play with the remoteness of their location, because it was so inconvenient to get there, and portray it as a journey to someplace exotic or even a journey to salvation. And so I think you can often find this idea of the journey into a separate world because it works so nicely with the Yoshiwara brothel keepers' interests. And these businesses are connected.
Right.
The brothel keepers, the printmakers, popular culture in Edo is all bound up together.
Thank you.
So one of the things that you mention in your book, or you problematize, something I really like, is that I think when we think about the history of prostitution, it almost calls under the category of women's history. And you raise the point that it really should be considered men's history as well. I wondered if you have had further thoughts about that and whether, how that would change our kind of understanding of history. I imagine that your book gets put under the category women's history. So anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I do think of myself as a historian of women in particular. But when I wrote this book, I think one of the things that I wanted to make clear was when we use terms like pleasure quarter, or when we look at Utamaro's paintings, we are in the position of the patron or the client. We are not in the position of the woman who's working, who would never have called it a pleasure quarter, right? And so I think that making both of those positions clear was very important. And it was also important to me to map out the various interests of the players involved in this industry. So to be kind of very serious, take the brothel keepers themselves seriously. What were they doing? How were they running their business? To take the interests of the magistrates seriously. They needed tax revenue to run the post station system. They did not like disorder. They felt some sympathy for women, and this is how they reconciled their competing priorities. So it does end up being a history of men and women. The reason that I emphasize the experiences of women, in particular in this book and in the talk, is because we find ourselves, without thinking about it, in the position of the male patron.
We were discussing before the program today, we're all historians up here, but historians of Japan in different ways. And I'm very happy that we can have these kinds of situations where the information you have, the analysis that you have of a particular moment in time, and what we have, how it was depicted, why, the background, can come together. Any kind of art, if you have paintings of battle, there is the harsh reality of what real war is, death. If you have whatever, there's always the real background. And in this case, when you have depictions of beauties in their fantasy worlds and so forth, you have the harsh reality. As a museum goer, but not an art historian, where do you think our field should be going in this reality? Because there's clearly a taste for this kind of exhibition going forward. This may be one of the first exhibitions of Ukiyo-e that I know of where the subject is brought out in great clarity, the social subject. So any thoughts you would have on that, I'd be interested.
I think this exhibit did an excellent job with that part of it, and I think it's through your efforts and through Professor Davis's as well. I think that, of course, we can appreciate these images as art, right? I went and I looked at the paintings, and they're breathtaking. And of course, we should display them, and we should look at them. I think that at the same time that we appreciate them, that we should also think more clearly and perhaps more deeply about the society in which they were produced. And it's not just kind of a society that produces art that has certain aesthetic values. It's a society that has particular moral values as well. And so I think it's not only important to say, okay, this is what these women did, these are the conditions that they might have worked in. And at the same time, I think it's also important to say, and not everybody in that society thought that was okay either. And so I think it's to make those 2 points clear, as well as the kind of aesthetic qualities that you see in the paintings.
Thanks so much. One of the interesting things about working in the Edo period and working on ukiyo-e images of women and women's history is that sometimes people want to suggest that it's unique to Japan, and they want to suggest that these kinds of situations were only present in Japan, whatever it is. And in this case, I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the ways in which this wasn't unusual to Japan, and it was part of a larger sort of early modern history.
That's clearly the case. One of the places you can find the clearest parallels is in China, where you see a similar system of indentured prostitution and very similar debates about whether or not this is appropriate in late imperial China. So around 1800, when Utamaro is making these paintings, people in China are having many of the same debates about what is the place of prostitution in our society. But of course, there are brothels everywhere. There are brothels in London. There are brothels in Paris. They did not necessarily work on the indenture system, but it is common that municipal governments, city governments, would receive tax revenue from brothels. That is a very common early modern phenomenon. So there we see that Japan is much like other places in the early modern world. One other thing about the city of Edo that I didn't get to talk about very much today because I was focused on this one issue is there were a lot of different things that women could do to survive in Edo other than prostitution. And we see paintings of that all the time. So we see, there are waitresses. We see women who are peddlers. They're selling tofu or they're selling charcoal. There are women who are wives in merchant houses who are, working the abacus. So we see a lot of different kinds of work. There are actually a lot of different kinds of work in Ukiyo-e themselves, as Professor Davis has done a lot of work on. And so this is one segment. This is one possibility for what it might have been like to be a woman in Edo. And it was often presented alongside other possibilities.
So I'll ask you one more question, then we'll open it up to the audience, and that is, could you tell me about this new book? It sounds fabulous.
This new book is much less depressing than the first one. I know, I'm very depressing, but luckily we have sunshine to give us a little bit of humor after this. So my new book is coming out from Scribner in 2020, hopefully just in time for the 2020 Tokyo Olympics. And it is a true story. I'm a historian, I write nonfiction, about this woman who was born in Echigo province in the snow country as the daughter of a Buddhist priest who just could not manage to stay married. She got divorced 3 times, and then she decided she'd had enough of the countryside and she ran away on her own to the city of Edo. And there she had a number of adventures trying to survive in different jobs, none of them prostitution, thankfully. And she married a masterless samurai and ended up working for one of Edo's most famous city magistrates, and she died there in 1853, just before Commodore Perry, the American who kind of sailed into Edo Bay and quote-unquote opened Japan, arrived. So this book uses her story as a way of illuminating the history of Edo in 1800, the biggest city in the world, and telling us about what it might have been like to live there.
I can't wait. Are there questions from the audience? Do we have a roving mic? Wow, just a few questions. We'll get the mic, hang on. Okay.
I can speak very loudly, so I think people will hear. We see there is, Amy, that's a wonderful book. Absolutely wonderful. We see Conception Mountain, but I assume there was not much in the way of contraception. You didn't really talk at all about children who were born, perhaps unwanted children. Perhaps there was also a psychology of wanted children to get out of certain things. So where do they fit into all of this?
That's a really excellent question. So sometimes you see in paintings or pictures of Yoshiwara very high-ranking prostitutes with children, and this was seen as a mark of their status, that they're able to bear and keep their children with them. Another place where we see the children of prostitutes being really important is in Nagasaki, which was the only city that was open to foreign trade, in which the prostitutes in Nagasaki met often with foreign men, Chinese and Dutch. The shogunate kept track of their children because they were considered potential foreign agents, and so they had very careful registries of the children who were born to Nagasaki prostitutes and foreign men. In other places, the evidence is much more shaky. We do know that there were forms of contraception being practiced in the so-called pleasure quarters. They were probably not very effective. But another thing to remember is that one of the symptoms of venereal disease is infertility. Also, abortion was very commonly practiced in early modern Japan, and so we assume that that was one of the ways that prostitutes avoided bearing children.
Hi, this is a great presentation. Thank you very much. Can you comment on the status of geishas today and whether they are in fact working under certain types of long-term sort of quasi-indentured contracts?
No. So that was all made illegal. So thankfully, this is not the situation in Japan today. And prostitution itself was banned in Japan in the 1950s. Indenture contracts are long gone. So geisha, apprentice geisha will have agreements with the houses that they're working for, but they are definitely not bound to be there for some length of time. They are free to leave. It would be against Japanese law if not.
So I'll start by making a quick observation because you've all said something very interesting. You mentioned war and paintings of war and the reality of war, which is really the paintings were propaganda of some sort, aesthetic, but propaganda. So my question is Utamaro advertising prostitution?
Yes. And it's really important to think about the fact that Utamaro would have been hired by publishers to produce these images. And one of his main publishers, the one who really launched his reputation as an illustrator of pictures of women, was himself the man who made the twice annual guidebooks to the Yoshiwara district. And his shop was outside the Great Gate, Tsutaya Juzaburo. So many of Utamaro's early images were published by Tsutaya so that you can see this relationship between these images and the trade itself. Yeah. We find very few images that show what I think of as the darker side of the Yoshiwara or the other pleasure districts. Most of the time they tend to sort of glamorize and I would say market those quarters. Do you want to add?
No, I think that's perfect.
What were the protections that the women in service had? Were there any?
So legally, the contract did not allow any protections for the women. However, it's a really good question because in reality, the best protection that an indentured woman had was her parents. And if her parents lived nearby, they could often exert some kind of pressure on the brothel keepers or appeal to the shogunate because the shogunate actually recognizes the importance of parents, right? And the importance of being loyal to one's parents. The best examples of this are from Nagasaki because all of the prostitutes in the Nagasaki quarter were from Nagasaki by law. They lived near their parents. Their parents would actually send them men as clients that they wanted them to marry so that the men could buy them out. Or if the woman ran away, her parents would shelter her and sometimes appeal to the shogunate saying, my daughter is being mistreated. And often the shogunate looked upon this very favorably as an example of the proper good feeling between parents and children. So that was the best kind of protection that a prostitute could have in this situation. If she had parents who lived nearby and were willing to intervene on her behalf. This is why Hatsu, the serving girl in her petition, said, my father's very far away and he can't petition for me. Ordinarily, he's the one who would have taken that responsibility.
And one of the stories that you tell in your book, a young woman is sold, I think, by her stepfather or some other male relative, but her mother comes in and intercedes and is able to quash the contract, right? So I thought that was really fascinating that there were, if somehow the woman was pulled in illegally or tricked, that her parents could intercede.
And there are laws saying that, it's only your legitimate parents who can sell you into this contract, not some guy claiming to be your uncle, right? And if your legitimate parents are found and they object, you can be let out of service.
Thanks. I've just been wondering about sources. You said there's one woman who wrote her own complaint to get out of service, and other women who signed their agreements with their fingernail. Do you have primary sources in the writings of these women? Did any of them keep diaries? I mean, what are your primary sources?
We don't have that type of source. Some very high-ranking prostitutes in Yoshiwara became accomplished poets. And so there's sometimes poetry collections that claim that they were written by a prostitute in Yoshiwara. We do not have what we would expect, a diary saying, and today I did this, and that was not something that women in service would have done. So what we have, the best evidence that we have is usually court cases, and not really court cases, but petitions to the magistrates, and the magistrates' investigations, and a record of a parent's testimony, the record of the girl herself and her testimony. Those are her words that are mediated through the magistrate recording them, but those are the best sources that we have into the lives of women. Yes. So the age varies according to what kind of service it is. For geisha houses, you often see very, very young girls being indentured, 8 or sometimes even younger, because they need a long period of training before they can serve as geisha. The Bakufu, the shogunate, had a law that you could not have a contract over 10 years long, and so that kind of limited the young end. Another interesting thing about contracts is that the younger you were at the time of contract and the longer your term of service, the less money your parents would get, which you would think would be the opposite. But the reason is that the brothel keeper would have to invest so much in your training and your room and board before you were able to see customers, customarily was around the age of 15, that they did not want to pay as much.
And also, we distinguish between difference between geisha
Mhm.
and you did not mention oiran or courtesan.
Mhm.
And the courtesan has much higher or extensive education in a way.
Mhm.
We tell the visitors
Mhm.
that they not only, of course, they have to know how to do ikebana,
Mhm.
tea ceremony, also the know how to learn the calligraphy, also
Yeah, that is, yeah.
poetry,
That,
and then
mhm.
the conversation. And for geishas, they study shamisen, dance, and so on. Is that correct or not?
Yes, of course. It is absolutely true that high-ranking prostitutes in Yoshiwara were incredibly accomplished. They had to be. That their artistic accomplishment and their elegance and their grace were all part of what the brothel was selling, right? And so this level of accomplishment was very important, and they were often quite artistic. And it's not taking anything away from their accomplishment to say, though, that they're bound to the exact same indenture contract, and they could be sold to any other brothel at any time. So I think there's a difference between saying people were incredibly educated and proficient and artistic, and saying that they had any degree of autonomy. So those are two different things.
One quick question. Do we have any idea what contribution to the economy on a percentage basis at the time, say in Edo?
I would love to know that. The only ways you can think about this are through thinking about the number of women who are involved in the trade, but that is very difficult because while the shogunate kept very good records about Yoshiwara, everybody else had an incentive to lie about how many women they employed to avoid being taxed. The best numbers we have about taxation come from post stations, and there were a number of post stations where about 10% of their operating budget came from taxes on prostitutes. And the usual argument that post station proprietors and brothel proprietors would make is, if you outlaw this business, the economy will tank. And actually, it was true. In the tempo reforms, the shogunate in the 1841 did crack down on prostitution, sent the Fukagawa geisha into Yoshiwara, really made an attempt to kind of rid the city of what they started to call illegal prostitution, and the economy tanked. So these activities really are very important to the maintenance of the early modern economy.
As you mentioned, sexually transmitted disease was a big issue. A disease like syphilis is pretty easily recognized. You either have a chancre or you have a skin rash. Was there any public health efforts at all, or were certain pleasure houses marked as this is a place you don't want to go because of that? And secondly, what was the status of homosexuality at this time?
Yeah, those are two big questions. The first, you would need to be more fluent in the history of medicine than I am. I do know that there is a lot of kind of comic verse in Edo about prostitutes who wore very thick makeup in order to disguise, right? Or who used various tricks in order to kind of disguise the fact that they had syphilis. And yes, so, but I don't think there was ever, I've never seen anything about this brothel is one to avoid. Syphilis was considered to just kind of be out there. People had all sorts of theories about who got it badly, who died from it, how you could avoid it, etc. The question about homosexuality is a really big one. People didn't have a category of sexual identity the way we do now, like I am gay or I'm straight. And it was different for women and for men. So male-male sexuality was fairly common and sanctioned. There were brothels at which you could purchase the services of men. Men could purchase the services of men. Many fewer of them than there were brothels at which people could purchase the services of women. And female-female sexuality is another interesting question that we don't know very much about. And a lot of times we think that people might have imagined the all-female spaces of the brothel as one in which women might have turned to each other for comfort or for sexual gratification. And there are some depictions of that, but again, it's fantasy, so we don't really know.
Let's just take one more question. Thanks.
Following up on that, did it become a sisterhood? Did it become that they became friends and their own family? Was that the structure that happened?
That's a really complicated question. In popular culture, in literature, it's often portrayed as the opposite, that these women were brutally competitive. But of course, that too is a male fantasy. So we don't exactly know what happened between the women. I mean, if you read still fictional depictions of brothels, you see that trope come up again and again, that the women hate each other, they're constantly competing. I can think of cases like in the Nagasaki situation when the magistrate apprehended women for smuggling, for example. They could have been helped by other women, right? So those connections surface in unexpected ways. So I assume that there was friendship in brothels, but it's difficult to see.
I think that we're going to prepare for our next Rakugo performance shortly, so we'll call it to a close here. Perhaps each of us might want to make a summary statement, if that's of interest to you. I would just like to close by saying that if you look at these scrims here that we have at the entrance, alternating turn-of-the-century Western beauties with figures taken from our various paintings, we set up a contrast of East and West or different cultures, and we've talked about how women are depicted in different cultures, talked about prostitution in different cultures. But it has struck me, and I think Julie, over the course of preparing for this exhibition, that in the case of Japan, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to find an attempt to depict idealized female beauty outside of the subject matter we're seeing today. You don't have the Venus de Milo. You don't have Greek statues that depict both male and female beauty. And it becomes a conundrum for Japanese artists as we enter the 20th century. They don't have a model to say what a woman looks like. This to me is fascinating and very different from other world culture arts that I'm aware of. And for the same topic, Japan has no Hogarth. Japan has no rough and tumble comedic artist who depicts exactly the behind the scenes goings on in the brothels that you find in other European art, German, French, English. Just an observation.
Well, thanks, Jim, for making it difficult for me. Let me just add a couple of things to this idea about idealized images of ideal beauty. I mean, I think that we might turn to some images of Benzaiten, one of the goddesses, as a possible alternative idea. We might look at some of the Shinto figures. We might look a little bit further than that. And in some Ukiyo-e, of course, we have images of wives and mothers and daughters and tofu sellers. So we do have some images that aren't necessarily associated with prostitution. But because so much of Ukiyo-e has to do with this trade in selling bodies, this sort of, even those mothers and daughters become kind of subject to the same kind of appreciative gaze. And they're, I would say, in a way, are part of this sort of larger sexualization of the image of the woman throughout the Edo period. But it's a really complicated question. And another complicated question that I sometimes encounter is when my colleagues I work in a department where most of the other people work on European and American art, and I'll give a presentation and I'll say, oh, this woman is, thought to be super sexy, and my colleagues will say, but how? They'll say, she's completely covered up. And it's because the signs of sexiness are different, right? So showing the back of the neck, showing a little bit of cleavage, showing the wrist, showing the way the folds go around the body. These are all things that were meant to draw you in and see these pictures as sexy. So then I like to turn around and I say to them, well, but your pictures are so much soft porn. All these nudes. I mean, let's talk about that. I mean, what is that really to do? So I think that one thing that we can do as art historians is to and historians is to expand the conversation and to look a little bit like these scrims do at the ways in which the idealization of a particular type occurred over time and occurred at the same time around the world.
I didn't really have a closing statement prepared. I would say that the main point for me is that we should give the past its due, that we should not assume that because it is the past, it's hundreds of years ago, and in a different place, that society is less complex than ours. And if you think about, what image would appear of American society in 2017 in a museum someplace, and imagine an audience, 200 years from now, discussing an image of a woman from an advertisement and trying to extrapolate all kinds of generalizations about what the United States was like as a society or as a civilization. We realize that that's impossible, right? So I think that when we see these images, we should consider that this is one thing that they're showing us, one facet of a very complicated conversation going on in a very complex society that is just as rich and interesting and complicated as our own. And other than that, I wanted to just thank everybody for being here to hear such a depressing talk on such a beautiful afternoon.
Thank you so much. It was fabulous.